For nearly 20 years, the name Natalee Holloway has haunted headlines and hearts alike. She wasn't just a missing person, she became the face of unresolved tragedy. A girl next door whose story gripped the world and refused to let go. Her disappearance was not just a personal nightmare. It was a public reckoning with justice, media, and truth. And for all those years, one man held the key. Joran van der Sloot, the last person seen with Natalee, never faced justice for her disappearance. Instead, he cloaked himself in lies, misled investigators, and left Natalee's family trapped in an endless cycle of hope and heartbreak. Every twist, every false confession, every manipulation was another knife in their wound. Then, in 2023, everything changed. In a small courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama, far from the beaches of Aruba where this story began, Joran finally confessed. Not some half-hearted story or vague implication, a full, detailed confession. He admitted to killing Natalee, and he described it in chilling detail. The mystery was over, but the horror wasn't. It wasn't a triumph. It was a gut punch. No revelation could undo the years of suffering or bring Natalee back to her mother's arms. But for Beth Holloway, who had spent nearly 2 decades chasing ghosts, it was something. It was the truth she had been denied for so long. It was clarity. Raw, heartbreaking clarity. But why now? Why confess after all these years? What made Joran finally speak the truth? And what does this say about the justice system, about international investigations, and about how media coverage can shape and sometimes distort a tragedy? If you were around in the early 2000s, you remember Natalee. Her smile was on every TV screen. Her story was in every home. She was just 18, full of life, celebrating her high school graduation on a dream trip to Aruba. But that dream turned into a nightmare, and the ripples from it are still being felt today. This video uncovers the full story. The night she vanished. The years of deception, the media storm, and the final devastating confession. This isn't just a true crime case. It's a story about truth, obsession, and the unbearable cost of justice delayed. May 30th, 2005 was supposed to be the final night of a dream vacation. Natalee Holloway, fresh out of high school and headed to college in the fall, was in Aruba, with over 100 of her classmates from Mountain Brook High School in Alabama. It was a rite of passage, the kind of senior trip that marks the end of childhood and the beginning of everything else. That night, Natalee was seen leaving Carlos and Charlie's, a popular nightclub in Oranjestad. She got into a car with 3 young men, Joran van der Sloot and brothers Deepak and Satish Kalpo. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. When Natalee didn't show up the next morning for the group's flight home, alarm bells went off. She was a responsible student, close to her family, and had plans for her future. Her luggage was still in her room, untouched. She hadn't just wandered off. Something was very wrong. Within hours, her disappearance became a full-blown crisis. Her parents, Beth and Dave Holloway, immediately flew to Aruba. They didn't wait for answers. They demanded them. And they pointed fingers quickly, naming Joran van der Sloot as the last person seen with their daughter. At first, Joran told police that he and the Kalpo brothers had dropped Natalee off at her hotel around 2 a.m. But security footage didn't back that up. Soon, the story changed. Joran then claimed he left her on the beach near the Marriott Hotel. This shifting narrative triggered suspicion, but not immediate arrests. The Aruban authorities, faced with enormous media pressure and a foreign government, watching closely, struggled to act decisively. Within days, 2 hotel security guards were arrested, seemingly based on weak leads. They were released after a week with no charges filed. Meanwhile, Natalee's face was plastered across television, screens and newspapers around the world. The search for her became an international spectacle. Aruba's beaches, ponds, hotels, and landfills were scoured for any clue, but nothing turned up. Despite extensive searches with local police, FBI agents, cadaver dogs, and volunteers, Natalee had vanished without a trace. On June 9th, the Calpo brothers and Joran were arrested for the first time. Under Aruban law, suspects can be held based on reasonable suspicion, but the case quickly became a media circus. As interrogations began, the suspects' stories continued to evolve. Each version only deepened the mystery. In one account, Joran claimed Natalee wanted to stay on the beach while he walked home. In another, he said he was dropped off at his house while the Calpos drove off with her. None of it added up, and inconsistencies between the suspects led to infighting and finger-pointing. By July, Dutch military jets were scanning the island with infrared sensors. A local gardener claimed to see the boys near the racket club early that morning. A jogger said he saw men burying something in a landfill, but every search came up empty. The frustration grew. Accusations flew. At one point, even Joran's father, Paulus van der Sloot, was arrested, briefly, as a potential accomplice. Through it all, Beth Holloway became a constant presence in front of cameras. Her grief turned into fury. She called out the Aruban, government, the suspects, and anyone she believed was obstructing justice, and still, no Natalee. That night on May 30th was the moment everything changed, not just for Natalee, but for her family, for Aruba, and for the tens of millions who followed. Her story, a celebration, turned to tragedy, and the truth slipped quietly into the darkness of a Caribbean night. From the start, Joran van der Sloot was more than just a suspect. He was a master manipulator. His involvement in Natalee Holloway's disappearance wasn't just criminal, it was deeply personal, psychologically tormenting for her family, and a media spectacle driven by his endless web of lies and contradictions. Joran's stories shifted, constantly. Initially, he said he and the Calpo brothers dropped Natalee off at her hotel. Then he claimed he left her alone on the beach. Every time the narrative seemed to settle, he changed it again. With each new version, he pulled investigators, journalists, and Natalee's grieving family into a deeper spiral of confusion and false hope. The most disturbing part? Joran seemed to enjoy it. He relished the attention. In 2008, Dutch crime reporter Peter R. de Vries aired a secretly recorded video of Joran appearing to confess. He described how Natalee collapsed and died, and how her body was disposed of. But once the footage went public, Joran dismissed it as a lie told to impress someone he thought was a drug dealer. Another version, another retraction, another blow, to a family desperately searching for truth. This wasn't a one-time stunt. Joran repeated this cycle for years, confessing, then denying, feeding false hope to a desperate family, only to rip it away again. In one interview, he claimed Natalee was sold into sex trafficking. In another, he said she died accidentally. Each story was more sensational than the last, none of them true, and then came the ultimate betrayal. In 2010, Joran contacted Beth, Holloway's attorney, claiming he would reveal the location of Natalee's remains for $250,000. Beth agreed to an initial $25,000 payment. Joran took the money and gave them nothing but a lie. He pointed them to a house, said she was buried in its foundation. When authorities investigated, they found it was completely fabricated. He had never even been inside the property. This wasn't just extortion, it was cruelty on a scale few can comprehend, monetizing a mother's grief for personal gain with zero remorse. Later that same year, while on the run in South America, Joran murdered Stephanie Flores in Peru, just 5 years after Natalee vanished. Her body was found in his hotel room. He was arrested and sentenced to 28 years in prison. Suddenly, Joran wasn't just a suspect anymore. He was a convicted killer. Even from prison, he couldn't stop seeking attention. He gave more interviews, offered more fake confessions, and remained in the media spotlight. It wasn't until he faced extradition to the United States on extortion and wire fraud charges that something shifted. In 2023, Nearly 2 decades after Natalee's disappearance, Joran confessed. As part of a plea deal for his crimes against the Holloway family, he gave a detailed account of what really happened that night in Aruba. It wasn't a revelation. It was confirmation of what everyone had feared. He had tried to sexually assault Natalee. When she resisted, he struck her in the head with a cinder block and dragged her body into the ocean. The confession was cold, flat, and devoid of remorse. But it was finally believable. Investigators called it credible and consistent with long-held suspicions and known details from earlier investigations. Joran van der Sloot's manipulations weren't just lies. They were psychological warfare. He didn't just evade justice. He exploited a tragedy for attention, money, and control. And in doing so, he prolonged a nightmare that could have ended long ago. In the end, his final confession may have brought answers. But it also confirmed something darker. That for almost 20 years, Joran van der Sloot wasn't just hiding a crime. He was weaponizing it every chance he got. For nearly 2 decades, the mystery of what happened to Natalee Holloway haunted her family, captivated the public, and frustrated law enforcement. Every tip, every lead, and every supposed confession had ended in disappointment. Until 2023. That year, Joran van der Sloot found himself in a courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama. But he wasn't there for Natalee. He had been extradited from Peru to face federal charges in the U.S., specifically wire fraud and extortion. Charges stemming from that cruel 2010 scheme, where he offered to sell information about Natalee's remains to her grieving mother. As part of a plea agreement, Joran was required to give a full, truthful account of what happened to Natalee Holloway on the night of May 30th, 2005. It was the first time he was legally obligated to speak the truth, and this time, he did. According to his confession, Joran met Natalee at the casino in the Holiday Inn where she was staying. Later, they left the nightclub together and headed toward the beach. Joran admitted he tried to initiate sexual contact with her, but Natalee refused. That's when everything turned dark. He described how he became enraged by the rejection. In a moment of uncontrollable violence, he picked up a nearby cinder block and struck her in the head. The blow killed her instantly. Afterward, he dragged her body into the ocean and pushed it out to sea, hoping the tide would take away the evidence. Just like that. Brutal. Sudden. Final. There was no mystery, no accident, no romantic miscommunication. It was cold-blooded murder. A senseless act of violence committed by a teenager whose capacity for cruelty had been masked for years by his lies and smirks on camera. Law enforcement officials reviewed the confession and deemed it credible. Unlike his many past confessions, this one was detailed, consistent with prior evidence, and given under legal scrutiny as part of a court proceeding. Investigators confirmed that the timeline, location, and specific elements aligned with what they had long suspected but could never prove definitively. For Beth Holloway, it was a moment of terrible clarity. After years of waiting, searching, and suffering through Joran's manipulations, she finally heard the truth from the man responsible. "It's over," she said outside the courtroom. "Joran van der Sloot is no longer a suspect. He is the killer." It wasn't justice in the traditional sense. There was no murder charge, no trial in Aruba. But it was closure, as much as one could hope for in a case defined by ambiguity and deceit. The impact of that confession reverberated far beyond the courtroom. True crime enthusiasts, journalists, and ordinary people who had followed the case for years all took a collective breath. The world finally knew. Natalee hadn't wandered off, hadn't overdosed, hadn't disappeared into trafficking rings. She had been murdered, and her killer had finally admitted it. The confession also exposed the true nature of Joran van der Sloot. This wasn't a man burdened by guilt. His statement was delivered with a chilling lack of remorse. There was no sorrow, no regret, just facts, stated plainly, like recounting a mundane event from memory, and that perhaps was the final insult. Not just the violence he inflicted on Natalee, but the emotional torture he inflicted on her family, the lies he told to the world, and the cold way he finally acknowledged the truth without blinking. In the end, the confession didn't bring joy or triumph. It brought a sense of grim resolution. After nearly 20 years, the Holloway family finally had an answer. It wasn't the one they prayed for, but it was the truth. In the early weeks of Natalee Holloway's disappearance, Aruban authorities scrambled to piece together a case with no body, no weapon, and no solid witnesses. Under global scrutiny and relentless media coverage, they cast a wide net, and it showed. Just 5 days after Natalee vanished, 2 hotel security guards, Nick John and Abraham Jones, were arrested. They worked at a nearby hotel under renovation and had no proven link to Natalee. The arrest was based on statements from Joran van der Sloot and the Kalpoe brothers. The guards were released after a week, their lives briefly turned upside down. Soon after, on June 9th, police arrested Joran and the Kalpoe brothers. Under Aruban law, they could be detained on reasonable suspicion while evidence was gathered. But this approach led to problems. Early arrests with shaky justification, followed by mounting pressure to keep suspects in custody. The investigation spiraled. Surveillance was initiated. Phones were tapped. Emails monitored. Yet with every interrogation, the suspect's stories shifted. Joran said he left Natalee on the beach. Then he claimed she wanted to stay. Then he blamed the Kalpoes. They, in turn, pointed fingers back at him. Confusion deepened. Truth became harder to pin down. Public missteps followed. On June 11th, a government spokesperson incorrectly stated that Natalee's body had been found. The announcement was later retracted, blaming misinformation. Confidence in the investigation started to erode. As pressure mounted, other arrests followed. Steve Kroes, a local DJ, was briefly detained. Even Joran's father, Paulus van der Sloot, was brought in for questioning. Both were released soon after, with no charges. It became clear that authorities were grasping for traction. Despite conflicting stories, the most repeated version among suspects was that Joran and Natalee were left at the beach near the Marriott Hotel. This led police to focus search efforts in that area. A gardener said he saw the 3 young men near the racket club. A jogger reported witnessing men burying something in a landfill, but each promising lead faded into another dead end. Authorities turned to advanced tools. Dutch F-16 jets scanned the island with infrared sensors. The FBI joined the effort. Local police drained ponds, used cadaver dogs, and analyzed satellite images for signs of disturbed ground. Still, no trace of Natalee. In August, the Kalpoe brothers were rearrested, along with Freddie Arambatsis, a friend of Joran's tied to a different case. Investigators hoped renewed pressure would yield confessions. It didn't. All were released again. Officials admitted the tactic had failed. Weeks turned to months. By September, a judge ordered the release of all suspects, who were still required to remain available for questioning. But momentum had faded. The trail had gone cold. Throughout it all, Natalee's parents, especially Beth Holloway, remained in the public eye, demanding accountability. Aruban officials faced criticism not just from American audiences, but also from their own citizens. Some believed justice was being mishandled. Others felt their island was being unfairly vilified. The broader investigation became more than a criminal case. It was a reflection of how legal systems, media pressure, and public expectation can collide. Mistakes made early, arrests without, evidence, public misstatements, and reactive decisions complicated everything that came after. For years, the truth remained buried beneath false leads and shifting accounts. Real justice remained elusive. Not until nearly 20 years later, with Joran's confession in a courtroom far from Aruba, would the real story come to light. From the very beginning, the Natalee Holloway case wasn't just a criminal investigation. It was a media phenomenon. Within days of her disappearance, Natalee's photo was everywhere. Cable news shows ran constant updates, often with little new information. For weeks, it was inescapable. Natalee's name became a household one, not just in the U.S., but globally. There were reasons the case attracted so much attention. Natalee was young, white, attractive, and from an affluent background. She vanished in a foreign country under mysterious circumstances, and her mother, Beth Holloway, was relentless, media-savvy, and determined to keep her daughter's story alive. It was, tragically, the perfect storm for news outlets seeking ratings. Beth's appearances on shows like Nancy Grace, The Today Show, and Larry King Live helped maintain national focus. She spoke directly, emotionally, and with urgency. Her pain was evident, and her dedication undeniable. She became the face of a mother's worst nightmare and a symbol of perseverance. But the intensity of the coverage had consequences. Aruban authorities, unused to such media scrutiny, found themselves portrayed as incompetent or even corrupt. News anchors speculated on theories, suspects, and evidence, often without verification. Public opinion was shaped not by facts, but by sound bites and commentary. The narrative became one of justice delayed, fueled by a sense that if this had happened in the U.S., the case would have been solved. The pressure on Aruban officials was immense. Some arrests were likely made prematurely, partly to satisfy media expectations. Every new suspect became a headline. Every retraction became an outrage. And through it all, the truth became harder to reach. The media also played a role in elevating Joran van der Sloot. He became a strange kind of celebrity, interviewed on camera, analyzed in documentaries, painted as the charming, manipulative villain of a true crime drama. The constant attention arguably fed his ego and encouraged further lies, confessions, and contradictions. At the same time, many critics pointed out the disparity in coverage. The term missing white woman syndrome gained traction during this time. Advocates highlighted how cases involving people of color rarely received similar attention, raising important questions about whose stories are told and why. As the years dragged on, Natalee's story was revisited again and again. True crime specials, documentaries, dramatizations, podcasts. Everyone had a theory. Everyone had an angle. And every time Joran van der Sloot said anything, even from prison, it made headlines. Some of that coverage helped. It kept the pressure on. It reminded the world that the case wasn't closed. But it also blurred the lines between journalism and entertainment, between justice and spectacle. In the end, the media didn't solve the case. But it shaped how we saw it, how we remembered it, and how we demanded answers. When Joran van der Sloot finally confessed in 2023, it brought a long-awaited conclusion to the mystery, but not to the pain. For Natalee Holloway's family, the confession was as much a wound as it was a resolution. It confirmed what they had feared for years, and it left them grappling with what justice really means when a loved one is gone forever. Beth Holloway, who had become a public figure through her tireless pursuit of the truth, stood outside the courthouse and declared, "It's over." But in reality, it wasn't over. Not emotionally, not spiritually, not in the way that brings true peace. Still, Beth and the Holloway family had done more than just fight for their own daughter. They used their platform to raise awareness about missing persons, international travel safety, and legal reform. Beth founded the International Safe Travels Foundation, aimed at educating students and families about how to travel more safely, abroad. In 2010, she also opened the Natalee Holloway Resource Center in Washington, D.C., housed in the National Museum of Crime and Punishment. The center was created to help families of missing persons navigate the complex and often overwhelming process of international investigations. It was a way of turning personal tragedy into public service, but the aftermath wasn't just shaped by advocacy. It was also shaped by controversy. The Holloway family had a complicated relationship with the Aruban authorities. At times, they accused officials of incompetence, corruption, or deliberate delay. In return, some Aruban locals and officials felt they were unfairly maligned by the U.S. media and public. In 2005, just months after Natalee disappeared, Alabama Governor Bob Riley and the Holloways called for a boycott of Aruba. The move sparked political waves. Some American politicians supported the idea, others criticized it. Aruban leaders pushed back hard, insisting their justice system was being unfairly attacked. The boycott effort ultimately faded, but it highlighted the tension between grief and diplomacy, between personal outrage and public policy. It was a stark reminder of how one tragedy can ripple far beyond its immediate circle. Even years later, Beth Holloway remained outspoken. She published a book, Loving Natalee, and appeared in multiple interviews and documentaries. She never let the public forget who Natalee was, not just a victim, but a vibrant, ambitious, loving daughter and friend. That legacy mattered. It kept the story alive, it kept the pressure on, and it inspired others facing similar tragedies to speak up, fight back, and demand answers. Joran van der Sloot's final confession closed a chapter, but it also underscored everything that had gone wrong, how a predator could manipulate systems, exploit grief, and hide behind legal technicalities for so long. In the end, the Holloway family's greatest strength may not have been in finding answers, but in surviving the weight of the unknown for so many years, and still choosing to turn their grief into action. After all the years, all the false starts, all the media storms and emotional whiplash, the Natalee Holloway case has an answer. Not the answer anyone wanted, but the one that had been feared all along. Her life was taken in a moment of rage by someone she had just met on what was supposed to be a joyous milestone. There was no grand conspiracy, no elaborate cover-up, just a horrific act of violence followed by nearly 2 decades of deception. Joran van der Sloot's confession didn't deliver justice in the way people hoped. It didn't lead to a body. It didn't bring closure in the emotional sense. But it did bring the truth. A long-delayed, cold, undeniable truth. Sometimes, that's all there is. For Natalee's family, and for those who followed this case for years, this truth is the only form of justice that remains. Her story exposed the flaws in international investigations, the power and pitfalls of media attention, and the resilience of a family that refused to give up. And maybe, just maybe, her name will continue to remind us why we fight for answers, because the truth matters, even when it hurts. If this story moved you, subscribe and like the video.